Genesis gives the Nephilim 4 verses. In them, the sons of God take human wives. Those wives bear children, and the Nephilim are on the earth in those days. Then the text stops. No explanation, no consequence, and turns to the flood. It is one of the most compressed and enigmatic passages in Genesis, but not a stray fragment. A much fuller version of the same tradition survives in the Book of Enoch, and it supplies almost everything those 4 verses leave out. By the end of this video, you will understand what Genesis 6 says, and pointedly does not say, about the Nephilim, the fuller Enochic account of their origin and nature, and the one thing Genesis omits entirely: what the giants' deaths left behind. A text that gives an entire episode only 4 verses, right before the flood, is assuming something. That its first readers already knew the rest. The surrounding tradition familiar enough to leave largely unsaid. And that fuller account does not end where Genesis does. It says the giant's death released something which, in the text's own terms, is still here. The single detail Genesis leaves out most completely. The entire biblical account of the Nephilim is 4 verses long, and most of what readers believe about them is not in it. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what Genesis 6:1 through 4 states, and the 3 things it conspicuously never explains. Here is the passage in substance. When human beings began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and took wives from among them, as many as they chose. The Hebrew phrase behind sons of God is Bene Ha-Elohim. Its meaning is one of the oldest cruxes in the interpretation of Genesis, whether it denotes divine or angelic beings, or is to be read in some other sense. We will hold that dispute and return to it because the passage itself does not pause to define the term. It assumes you already know who they are. Then a line about the span of human life, that God's Spirit will not remain in mortals forever, and that their days shall be 120 years. It sits oddly where it falls, this sentence dropped into the middle of the scene, as though it belonged to a different thread and was folded in here. Readers have long felt the seam. And then, on the far side of it, the verse that gives us the name. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the Gibberim, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That is the whole of it, 4 verses. Read them slowly, and notice what they contain, because it is less than memory supplies. There is a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. There are children born of that union. There are the Nephilim, present on the earth in those days and afterward. And there are the Gibberim, the mighty men, the men of renown. Genesis sets these terms side by side. What it does not do is explain how they relate. Consider the last of those terms, because it carries more than it seems to. The Gibberim are called the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And that final phrase, in the Hebrew, is literally men of the name. These are not described as monsters. They are described as mighty and renowned, the famous men of an earlier age, whose reputation outlived them, and whose names an audience would already recognize. Genesis is not warning its readers away from the Nephilim here. It is invoking them, trading on a fame the passage assumes already exists. You do not tell people that beings were of renown unless the renown precedes your telling. The verse leans on a reputation it did not create. This is the first of the passage's silences and the most consequential. The syntax that links the Nephilim, the Gibborim, and the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men is genuinely ambiguous in the Hebrew and has been read more than one way. On the most natural reading, the mighty men are the children of that union, and the Nephilim are named in the same breath as the giants of that age. But Genesis never states the equation in so many words. It names, it juxtaposes, and it leaves the reader to supply the connective tissue. Whether the Nephilim simply are those children, or stand somehow alongside them, the verse allows both and settles neither. The second silence is origin. Genesis tells you the Nephilim were on the earth. It does not tell you what they were, whether their size or their strength or their nature was anything beyond human writ large. It gives them no character past the word mighty and the phrase of renown. Where that nature came from, what it consisted of, why it should matter. On all of this, the passage says nothing. The third silence is the end. Genesis records that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And then it says nothing further about them. It does not narrate their deaths. It does not tell you what became of them. It moves, in the very next verse, to the wickedness of humankind and the resolve to send the flood. And the Nephilim simply drop out of the account, unresolved, as though the text had somewhere more pressing to be. That small phrase, and also afterward, is the only thread it leaves hanging, an admission that these figures outlasted the moment of their naming, with no word on how or for how long. Put the three silences together, and the passage begins to look strikingly elliptical. Origin, nature, end. On each, Genesis is not vague, but simply silent. Whether that brevity reflects deliberate compression, inherited fragments, or a narrative background the writer could assume, is not a question these 4 verses answer, and not one we need to answer yet. What matters here is narrower. Genesis itself does not supply the origin, the nature, or the end that later readers routinely bring to the passage. The information is not in it. 4 verses, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Children born from that union. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And then the text turns away. To the flood. No origin, no nature, no end. Genesis names them and says almost nothing else. Return to the register of analysis. What Genesis 6 gives us is a naming without an explanation. The passage introduces the Nephilim as though they need no introduction, as figures its first audience already recognized, and then withholds their origin, their nature, and their end. Not because those things are unknowable, but because the text is not here in the business of telling them. Whatever those first readers knew of the Nephilim, they did not learn it from these 4 verses. The verses assume it. Genesis records that the Nephilim were on the earth. It never says where they went. That older account, the Book of Enoch, outside the Bible most readers use, takes up the first of those questions directly. It does not begin with the children. It begins with the descent. The Book of Enoch describes the same event Genesis reports in only 4 verses, but at length, and with the mechanism Genesis omits. By the end of this chapter, you will understand how the giants came to exist according to that account, and why their origin determines what happens to them. The section that concerns us is the opening of what scholars call the Book of the Watchers. Chapters 6 and 7 of 1st Enoch. It begins where Genesis only gestures. The Watchers are heavenly beings. The name reflects a class of angel described as wakeful, sleepless, set to observe. This is the reading the Book of Enoch assumes without argument, that the sons of God of Genesis are divine or angelic beings. And it was the dominant understanding through the Second Temple period, the centuries in which this literature took shape. In fairness, and without settling the point, a later and long influential alternative reads the sons of God not as angels, but as the human line of Seth, intermarrying with the line of Cain. That reading has its defenders, and the Genesis text does not decisively rule it out. The Enochic tradition, in any case, does not entertain it. For the account we are about to follow, the sons of God are the watchers. In the account, they look down upon the daughters of men, and they desire them. 200 of them bind themselves by a mutual oath to descend and take wives, and they come down and take them. Their leadership and the forbidden knowledge they are said to have taught belong to their own chapters of this story and are told elsewhere. Here it is enough to say the descent was collective, sworn, and deliberate. The tradition places it in the days of Jared, upon the summit of Mount Hermon, where the oath is sworn, a setting whose fuller weight belongs to another telling, and that names the place for us without pausing on it. What the descent is, at bottom, is the crossing of a line the account treats as fundamental. Heaven and earth, in this tradition, are not merely far apart. They are different orders of being, and the beings of one are not meant to take up the life of the other. The watchers are spirits. In coming down and taking wives, they do not simply disobey an instruction, they step out of their own category and into one that was never theirs. Everything monstrous that follows from that single crossing. The giants are not an unrelated calamity that happens next. They are the crossing made visible, the transgressed line given bodies, and Set walking the earth. What follows is the part Genesis withholds. The women conceive, and they bear children. But the children are not ordinary. The text describes them as great giants of monstrous size, a scale reported in figures so far beyond the human that they read less as measurement than as a sign that these were beings the created order had no room for. They are the offspring of a union between spirit and flesh, fathered by heavenly beings, born of mortal women, belonging fully to neither side of their parentage. In the Enochic account, there is no ambiguity of the kind Genesis leaves open. The giants of chapter 7 are the children of the Watchers, named as such, with a stated cause and a stated nature. For a time, the account implies these beings lived among the people they were born to, enormous, appetite-driven, but present, part of the world the descent had altered. That is what makes what follows land as betrayal and not merely as disaster. The giants do not arrive as an invading army from outside. They are born into families, among mothers, inside the human world. And it is from inside it that they begin to consume it. That plainness is the point. Where Genesis writes, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days," and gives no reason, the Book of Enoch gives the reason in full: a descent, an oath, a union, a conception. The equation of these giants with the Nephilim of Genesis is an interpretive linkage rather than a term the two texts share outright. The Enochic writers are narrating the same tradition, and they identify its giants without hesitation. But the exact word-for-word match with Genesis's vocabulary is something later readers supply. Held with that care, the point stands. The Enochic account supplies an origin Genesis itself does not give. And the account does not stop at their birth. It describes what the giants become. Their appetite is without limit. They consume the labor and the produce of humankind until there is nothing left to give them. And when men can no longer sustain them, the giants turn upon men, and then upon every living thing, the beasts, the birds, the creatures of the earth, devouring and at last devouring one another, until the earth itself cries out against the violence done upon it. And the crying out matters, because in the account, it does not go unheard. The devastation the giants work is what draws heaven's attention back down to the earth, and the ruin they cause becomes the reason the whole affair will one day be answered for. The giants are not a background detail in the tradition. They are the engine of the crisis that everything after them responds to. This is a portrait of a nature, not merely a size. The giants are destructive because of what they are. Beings whose very composition, spirit joined to flesh, is out of order, and whose hunger cannot be met by the world they were born into. Here the account plants something Genesis could not, because Genesis never described their nature at all. If these beings are compounded of two substances that were never meant to be joined, then the question of what becomes of them at death is already open. A creature made of spirit and flesh does not simply, cleanly cease. Two substances were joined in these beings that the created order otherwise keeps apart: the spirit that belongs above and the flesh that belongs below. And a thing so composed cannot be unmade the way a purely mortal thing is unmade. The account does not yet say what this means. It only lets the reader feel the pressure of the question. Everything in the description of the giant's birth is arranged so that their death will become a problem the text has to answer. The Book of Enoch describes how the giants were born, and in describing it, hints that how they were born will determine what happens when they die. The origin Genesis withholds is here supplied in full. And it would be entirely fair at this point to object that a later text has no business dictating how we read an older one. The case that the Book of Enoch is merely late legend built on top of Genesis has genuine scholarly weight. By the end of this chapter, you will understand that caution and the specific features of Genesis 6 that push against it. State the objection at its strongest, because it deserves that. The Book of the Watchers, in the form we can date, is a work of the 3rd century before the Common Era, centuries later than the Genesis passage as we have received it. On the face of it, then, the relationship looks obvious. Genesis is the old spare text. The Book of Enoch is the late fanciful expansion, an apocalyptic embroidery stitched over 4 terse verses. On this reading, Enoch cannot explain Genesis because Enoch comes after it. It can only decorate it, and to read the later text back into the earlier one. To let a 3rd century elaboration tell us what the sons of God and the Nephilim really were is to let the expansion dictate the meaning of the original. That is a real methodological danger, not a straw man. Expansions of terse texts are common across the ancient world, and the mere existence of a fuller version later does not license reading it back into the sparer version earlier. Name that clearly, and grant it its full force. On the plain matter of dating, the Book of the Watchers is later than Genesis 6, and the instinct to keep a late expansion from governing an old text is a sound one. Most careful readers stop here, and they are not wrong to feel the pull of it. The tidy version, old text, late embroidery, has the advantage of matching the dates on the page, and the further advantage of asking nothing strange of us. It is the comfortable reading, and comfortable readings are worth distrusting in close proportion to how little they cost. Hold on to the principle underneath the objection, though, because it is correct, and it will not simply be waved away. If all we had were 2 texts and their dates, the later one would have no standing to tell us what the earlier one meant. A commentary does not govern its source by being longer. So the burden falls exactly where it should, not on the assumption that the fuller account is older, but on the character of the shorter one. The only thing that could earn the Book of Enoch a hearing on Genesis is if Genesis itself, read entirely on its own, already behaves like a text pointing beyond its own borders. Then set it against what the Genesis passage actually does. Genesis 6 does not read like a self-contained origin story. It names the Nephilim without introducing them, records a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men without accounting for the offspring, and breaks off mid-thought to the flood. Whatever else that is, it is elliptical. At minimum, it is spare enough to suggest a narrative background larger than what survives in these 4 verses. What is genuinely contested is what that background was, and how closely any surviving text preserves it. 3 models compete to explain the relationship, and it is worth naming them plainly. The first, the Book of Enoch simply expands Genesis, taking the 4 verses as its seed, and growing the descent, the giants, and the spirits out of them. The second, Genesis and the Book of Enoch draw independently on older, traditional material, each shaping a shared inheritance in its own way, with neither derived from the other. The third, Genesis compresses a fuller tradition that the Enochic account preserves more of, so that Enoch is not downstream decoration, but a fuller witness to a background Genesis reduces. The evidence does not force a choice among them, and it matters to see why. A later expansion can invent, systematize, and import freely. The mere absence of the Watchers, the Oath, or the spirits from Genesis does not, by itself, prove that Genesis abridged a version that once held them. What the ellipsis of Genesis 6 establishes is that the passage assumes a tradition larger than its 4 verses. It does not establish which of these reconstructions best represents that tradition. The second and third models, the ones that grant the tradition real antiquity, are not fringe positions. They are associated with George Nicolsburg and the wider study of Enochic origins, and they rest on a single, sober observation. The dating of the manuscripts does not settle the age of the tradition inside them. A late text can carry an early story. This is why the debate turns on the age of the tradition, not the age of the scroll. Traditions of this kind circulated and were retold long before they took written form. And students of the Enochic literature, among them James van der Kam and Lauren Stuckenbrook, have traced how deep and how early the roots of the Watcher tradition may run beneath the text that finally fixed it in writing. None of that proves the tradition older than Genesis. It establishes only that the question is genuinely open rather than closed by a calendar. The earned mystery sits just beyond this. The fuller account is about to state plainly the one thing Genesis omits most completely, and it concerns not the giants' bodies, but what survived them. So, the question is not whether the Book of Enoch embellished Genesis with late legend. That framing has already collapsed. Genesis 6 plainly draws on a tradition larger than its 4 verses. What stays open is how directly the surviving Enochic account preserves that older background. Expansion, shared inheritance, or fuller preservation. The second half of this video does not need the question settled. It follows the fuller account to the part Genesis leaves out, and holds the direction of dependence exactly where the evidence leaves it, unresolved. The relationship stays open, then expansion, shared source, or preservation. But the fuller account contains one claim Genesis omits entirely, a claim about what the giants' deaths left behind. The Book of Enoch says the death of the giants was not the end of them. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what the text claims their deaths produced, and why it is the detail Genesis leaves out most completely. Everything so far has been preparation for a single passage, and it is time to read it. The tradition has built, carefully, towards the question of what a being made of 2 natures does at its death, and it is here, in a short stretch of the Book of the Watchers, that the tradition answers. The answer is strange enough that it is worth following the text's own reasoning step by step, rather than leaping ahead to the conclusion. The passage is 1 Enoch 15, verse 8, running into chapter 16, presented as speech, words given to Enoch to carry back. Its argument turns on the giants' composition. The giants, it says, were born from 2 sources: from the Watchers, who are spirit, and from mortal women, who are flesh. The text draws a line between the 2 orders. The spirits of heaven have their dwelling in heaven, and the creatures of earth belong to the earth. And it sets the giants across that line, born of both and native to neither. What, it asks, becomes of a being like that? The wider passage sets the question up. Heaven asks why. The Watchers, who were spirit, sought the flesh of women at all, and the words given to Enoch carry that question forward to the children. What the text does next is the part that matters, and it is worth taking only as far as the text takes it. The giants were born of spirit and of flesh. When their bodies die, the text does not send their spirits down with them? The answer is the claim Genesis never records. When the giants die, and in the tradition they do die, in the violence that consumes the pre-flood world, their bodies fall. But the text says that evil spirits go out from those bodies and remain upon the earth. Its stated reason is their mixed origin. Because the giants came from women, as well as from the watchers, from flesh, as well as from spirit, the spirits that leave them stay in the world of flesh they were partly made from. That is the claim, and the text states it plainly. From the giants' bodies, evil spirits upon the earth, afflicting and destroying until the day of the great consummation, the final judgment, which the account names only as the horizon it points toward and does not describe here. The text is specific about what these spirits do in the meantime, and about the terms on which they do it. They rise against people, they bring affliction and ruin, they work against men and against women, because it was in part from men and women that they came. And the account adds a detail that sharpens the whole picture. Through all of this, the spirits act, in its own phrase, without incurring judgment. The reckoning that will answer for them is set at the far end of the age, at the consummation, and until it comes, they are simply loose, unpunished. In the interval, the text opens between the flood and the end. They do not eat, and they are not thirsty, and they are not seen, bodiless now, where their fathers had crossed the other way into bodies, and yet they act upon the living. The account frames their whole existence as a kind of wrongness left running, beings with no rightful place, doing harm in the only world available to them across the entire stretch of time between the flood that ended their bodies and the judgment that has not yet ended them. The giants die, but evil spirits go out from their bodies. Born from the watchers and from women, they remain upon the earth, afflicting, destroying, awaiting the judgment the text places at the end. Their bodies die, their violence does not. Return to analysis. What the Book of Enoch has done in these verses is close the account Genesis left open, and close it in the one direction Genesis never so much as gestured. Genesis gave the Nephilim no end, and a reader could be forgiven for supplying one, for assuming the flood was their end, that the waters closed over the giants along with everything else. The Enochic tradition refuses that closure at the exact point Genesis leaves blank. The flood ends the bodies. It does not end the spirits. In the logic of the text, the deaths of the giants are the origin of the evil spirits that afflict the earth, a genuinely new category of being, brought into existence not by creation, but by the dying of something that should never have lived. That claim has a long reach into later tradition, and here restraint is required. The idea that hostile spirits derive from the dead giants leaves a mark on Second Temple thought and on the demonology that follows it, and its influence can be traced carefully. But it would overstate the evidence to call this passage the single historical origin of all later belief about such spirits. What can be said, and said safely, is narrower. Here is one of the earliest surviving attempts to answer a question many later traditions would also take up: where hostile, unseen affliction in the world comes from. And it answers by reaching back to the giants and their unquiet deaths. The passage is a source, and a powerfully shaped one. It is not, on its own testimony, a sole cause. This is why, of everything Genesis leaves unsaid, this is the omission that goes deepest. The origin of the giants is missing from Genesis, but a reader can feel the shape of that gap. Something caused them, and the cause has simply been left out. Their nature is missing too, yet the words mighty and of renown at least point toward it. What the Enochic account supplies here is different in kind. Genesis does not leave a gap where the ending should be. It leaves the impression that there is no ending to give, that the Nephilim were on the earth, and then were not, and nothing followed. The Book of Enoch does not fill a blank that Genesis marked out. It refuses a closure Genesis implied. That is the deeper kind of omission. Not a fact withheld, but a whole afterword written out. Genesis records an end it never actually narrates. The Book of Enoch narrates it and leaves it unfinished, a death that released something still at large. And even the word Genesis uses for these figures, it turns out, carries the same double story. The name Nephilim has never settled into a single agreed meaning. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the competing derivations and what each one implies about the passage. Begin with the reading most people have heard, because it is the most natural in Hebrew and the most freighted with consequence. The word is commonly connected to the Hebrew root NPL, the root that means to fall. On that derivation, the Nephilim are the fallen ones. And the pull of that reading is obvious, because it seems to name the whole tradition in a single word: fallen. As the watchers are said to have fallen from heaven, fallen as their offspring are marked by that descent from the first. It is a reading almost too apt, and its aptness is part of why it must be held carefully rather than seized. The connection to the root of falling is real. The leap from fallen to a full theology of descent is an interpretation laid over the word, not a meaning the word alone can bear. The same root has been pressed a second way. Read causatively. The verb can carry the sense not of falling but of felling, of bringing others down. And on that reading, the Nephilim would be not those who fell, but those who make others fall. This is a possible extension of the root, argued by some, and it is best held as a suggestion rather than a result. It is less secure than the plain sense of falling, and nothing in the passage signals that both senses were meant at once. A different derivation sets the Hebrew root aside altogether. On this proposal, the term comes instead from an Aramaic word for giant, in which case the name would describe size plainly, with no idea of falling in it at all. This is not another shade of the same word. It is a competing account of where the word comes from. If it is right, then fallen ones is not a deeper meaning hidden inside the name, but a later association laid over a word that first meant something simpler. The two derivations are not easily reconciled, and the evidence does not force a choice between them. And then there is what the ancient translators did with it. When the Hebrew scriptures were rendered into Greek, in the translation known as the Septuagint, Nephilim became gigantes, giants. That single choice shaped how the passage would be read for centuries afterward, in every tradition that received Genesis through its Greek form. Faced with a word open to more than one account of itself, the translators heard giants and rendered it so, recording in that decision which understanding they had received. That single rendering did more work than any commentary. For most of the long history in which Genesis was read, it was read in translation. And in translation, the Nephilim were giants, beings of size whose fault was their scale. The reader who met them through the Greek and through the Latin and the vernaculars that followed the Greek met giants and heard nothing of falling at all. A whole dimension of the Hebrew, the moral charge of descent, the fall suffered or the fall inflicted, traveled no further than the border of the language. The translators did not falsify anything. They chose, as translators must, and their choice quietly became the meaning for everyone standing downstream of it. It is tempting to treat all of this as a single problem to be solved, to find the one correct derivation and retire the rest. But the situation is not one word, holding several meanings at once. It is several competing histories for one word, and the evidence has never chosen between them. A Hebrew root that invites fallen, a causative reading some hear in it, an Aramaic derivation that would make it giant, and a Greek reception that chose giant and made the choice stick. These are rival explanations, not layers of a single settled sense. There is no need to make the ancient writer into a deliberate riddler to feel the weight of this. The name did not settle in antiquity, and it has not settled since. Different traditions heard different things in it, falling, felling, sheer size, and each carried its own hearing forward. What we are left with is not a single word that secretly means several things, but a word whose derivation was contested early and stayed contested, so that the figure at the head of one of the Bible's strangest passages arrives under a name its own transmitters could not agree on. And all of this concerns strictly the pre-flood figures of Genesis 6. The later giants who reappear elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible are a separate question, with an account of their own that is not this one, a name then that will not resolve, which raises a sharper question than any we have asked so far. The question of why Genesis would reduce all of this to 4 verses in the first place. The compression of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 may be the most telling thing about the passage. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why a tradition this large might survive in the biblical text only in miniature. Return to a feature we have kept in view. The 4 verses are elliptical. They assume a tradition larger than themselves. Set that beside a second fact, and a redaction question comes into focus. The story the 4 verses gesture at, heavenly beings descending, taking human wives, fathering a race of giants, is, in its bare shape, the kind of story the surrounding mythologies of the ancient Near East told in abundance. Gods coupling with mortals, and heroes of mixed parentage born from the union were common currency in the literatures around Israel. That wider background belongs to another telling, and can only be gestured at here. The cultures surrounding ancient Israel held rich traditions of gods, mortals, and the mixed offspring of their unions, and a text defining Israel's God against those cultures could not be indifferent to a story that sounded so much like theirs. And a text working to set the God of Israel apart from exactly those mythologies had a difficult thing on its hands. A tradition of divine human union that was clearly old, clearly known, and clearly awkward to carry unedited. One coherent way to read the compression, then, is as the trace of that difficulty. One possibility is that inherited material of this kind was retained while its narrative scope was reduced, kept on the page, but in a form too small to carry what the fuller versions carried. On this reading, the 4 verses are neither a full telling nor an outright suppression. What now survives is, in effect, a narrative minimum, enough to record that the tradition existed, too little to let it breathe. There is a difference worth marking between this reading and the cruder one it is often mistaken for. To say a tradition was compressed because it was awkward is not to say anyone hid a truth or falsified a record. Texts inherit more than they can comfortably use, and one of the ordinary things a tradition does with inherited material it cannot simply drop is to shrink it, to keep it on the page in a form small enough to hold. That is editing, not conspiracy. The compression of Genesis 6 can be read as that ordinary act performed on unusually charged material. And if so, the charge in the material is part of why the reduction is visible at all. The placement fits the reading. The passage sits immediately before the flood, attached almost to the account of the wickedness that brings the waters. A tradition about divine beings and their monstrous offspring, positioned at the very hinge where the earth's corruption becomes total, is a tradition being folded into the frame of a larger story and given a function within it, rather than told for its own sake. The fragment is not freestanding. It is set exactly where a compressed, half-swallowed tradition would be most useful and least able to unsettle the whole. And placement in a compiled text is itself a kind of statement. To set the fragment here and nowhere else is to decide what it is for. To turn a tradition that might once have stood on its own into a prelude, a last note of disorder before the waters come. In the text as we have it, the 4 verses do not merely sit beside the flood. They read as a prelude to it. Read that way, the 4 verses change character. They look less like a fragment that failed to explain itself than like a large tradition preserved in a deliberately small compass. Though whether that smallness was chosen or simply inherited is past recovering. The brevity that first looked like poverty can, on this reading, look like restraint instead. None of this is a claim about hidden motives or concealed truths. It is a reading of how texts absorb the traditions they inherit. But it does turn the compression from a puzzle into a possibility worth holding. On this reading, the 4 verses are short, not because there was little to say, but because a great deal stood behind them. A tradition established enough to keep, and reduced rather than retold. Whether that reduction was a choice or an inheritance, the passage does not tell us, and this chapter does not pretend to know. Set the whole of it beside itself now, the shorthand and the fuller account laid end to end, 4 verses. Genesis names the Nephilim and the mighty men of old, the men of renown, and explains none of it. a union with no offspring accounted for, a nature with no origin, figures with no end. The passage introduces them as though they need no introduction, and then it is gone. The account behind them, an older sustained tradition, carried in the Book of Enoch, in the chapters of the Watchers, describes the descent, the taking of wives, and the conception that the 4 verses compress into a single line. Where Genesis names, that account narrates. Where Genesis assumes, it explains. The mechanism Genesis withheld is here set down in full. The link that removes the easy dismissal. Genesis 6 plainly assumes a tradition larger than its 4 verses. It names without introducing and breaks off mid-thought. That does not settle which way the dependence runs. Expansion, shared source, and fuller preservation all stay open. But it does dissolve the tidy verdict that the Book of Enoch is merely late decoration. The omitted ending. The giants die, and in the fuller account their deaths are not the end of them. Their bodies fall, but evil spirits, the text says, go out from those bodies and remain upon the earth, doing harm in the only world available to them, until a judgment the account names but does not reach. The name itself, even its derivation, remains disputed. One explanation connects the Nephilim with the Hebrew language of falling, another with an Aramaic term for giants. The Greek translators chose gigantes, giants, and that ancient decision shaped centuries of reading. The word does not give us one uncontested answer. Its history gives us competing ones. And a tradition too established to omit, reduced rather than retold, and preserved in miniature, kept in 4 verses at the edge of the flood, enough to record that it existed, too little to let it speak, while the thing its ending released has, in the tradition's own terms, an afterlife of its own that runs on well past the page. 2 accounts of one event, written in different centuries. One reduces it to 4 verses and turns immediately to the flood. The other keeps the descent, the conception, the violence, and the strange afterlife the first leaves out. And in the fuller account, the death of the giants is not an ending. It is a beginning of something the text says is still on the earth. Neither text, on its own, is the whole of what was known. Genesis kept the names and the fact of them, and let the rest fall silent. The Book of Enoch kept the descent, the conception, and the afterlife, and let the compression fall away. Read together, they do not resolve one another. They hold between them the shape of a tradition larger than either, of which each preserves a different part. Whether Genesis compressed that tradition to bury it, or to preserve it in the only form a monotheizing text could carry, and whether the Book of Enoch expanded the story, or simply kept what Genesis assumed and abridged, is not a question the 4 verses settle.